Welcome to today's CoveTalk on mobilising the force with Colonel Renee Kidson. My name is Major Jeremy Barraclough and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. If you haven't yet downloaded the Cove app and turned on notifications and followed us on social media, please do so because that's the best way to keep across what's happening at the Cove. This CoveTalk will discuss the considerations for mobilisation, including some underlying assumptions about preparedness, the employment and the purpose, and a look at how we employ the reserve forces. Our guest speaker, Colonel Renee Kidson, she can talk with authority on this issue. She's currently employed at Army Headquarters in Scalability, and she is deployed on Operation Astute and also led the 5th Engineer Regiment recently on operations during bushfire assist. Ma'am, thank you so much for coming here today to talk to us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeremy. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. A privilege, as always, to be broadcasting this to you live from Gadigal and Bidjigal country here in Randwick. I also acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I would further like to acknowledge the deep tradition of protecting country in our Indigenous Australians and note that that's a tradition which the Australian Army also shares. Perhaps you can reflect for a moment on the country from which you're zooming in this afternoon, joining our CoveTalk. I prepared this presentation for the Chief of Army History Conference, which we delivered in November of last year. And as I was getting ready for today, I was reflecting on what a huge 6 months it has been and how much water has subsequently flown under the bridge. So as we move through this talk, it was date stamped at November of last year, reflect on what has shifted. And my objective is to speak for as short as possible. I've only got a handful of slides here because I'm way more interested in hearing about what you think around the future of the 2nd Division and the part-time force. So the 2019 to 21 period represented a campaign of domestic contingencies. We started with OBA, Op Bushfire Assist, which kicked off in about August 2019, went through to March 2020. We flowed directly into OCA, Op COVID-19 Assist, and that has only been recently disestablished as a task group. We then had a series of high-risk weather season responses, and the two that we have listed here were the Op New South Wales Flood Assist in March, April of last year, and then the Tropical Cyclone Seroja response in WA. As listeners around the country would be aware though, subsequent to that, of course, we had the WA fires, we had the Northern Rivers and Southern Queensland floods, and we've had a sequence of other events as well. But what this means is that this is an unprecedented ADF response was required, including mobilisation of the reserve. So for us, this is an opportunity to test ADF scalability, to examine some of these traditional reserve compromises, and I'll come to those, and then finally to think about how do we maximise the capability potential of the part-time component of our total force. So the central ideas of our paper are these. It is foundation warfighting skills that allow the ADF to respond well to short notice domestic contingencies. To this, the reserve can leverage some natural advantages of geography, relationships and expertise. And this allows the ADF to excel during domestic contingencies. By that I mean more effective responses, faster, especially because we were well enabled by the full-time force. There is a caveat. Reservists come with an opportunity cost to the wider economy. So the reserve is best thought about as a force for surge rather than sustain. So in essence, it's the integration and the embedding of both warfighting and civil military skill sets across the total force. That is what is critical to force scalability for the full spectrum of military operations we can anticipate. So for the ADF, both the full and part-time components of the total force require elements of both of those skill sets and a preparedness to use them in either onshore or offshore contingencies. Goodness me, hasn't this word become the zeitgeist of our times, unprecedented? However, if we just think about OBA, Op Bushfire Assist, it really was unprecedented, at least for the ADF, in three important respects. Firstly, the use of the reserve call-out provision under Section 28 of the Defence Act 1903. The second reason it was unprecedented is the 2nd Division was tasked to lead 3 JTFs simultaneously across 3 jurisdictions. This was a bit of a doctrine reversal. According to doctrine, full-time force leads, 2nd Division follows in support. OBA resulted in that doctrinal reversal. The third reason OBA was unprecedented is that this substantial ADF response was required for a domestic contingency, and that has prompted debate, as you well understand, on the role of the ADF domestically. So if we think about the types of ADF operation, we can come up with a matrix like this. We've got combat and security types of operations over here, and we've also got humanitarian aid and disaster relief. You can also think about structuring those types of operations according to whether they're onshore or offshore. Now, culturally, and our strategic culture is very orientated towards that specific type of operation. It's what we force structure for, it's what we train for. Combat and security missions offshore. So for these reasons, a task such as OBA is quite confronting to our strategic culture. This is a historical artefact, if you will. This is the original call-out order that was signed by the Minister for Defence and the Governor-General, and the quick anecdote behind this is that the CDF Chief of Staff at the time was Colonel Greg Novak. He was there waiting at Canberra Airport. Minister of Defence flew in, he received her signature. Chief of Staff then jumps in a staff car, races up to Sydney, 3 hours later pops out at Kirribilli, secures the Governor-General's signature on the call-out order, this slightly crumpled piece of paper. Photograph was taken on a mobile phone, sent through to Canberra. The Prime Minister announced the call out just after midday. We were at Holsworthy within 2 hours. So there you go, just a little anecdote there. Our method for undertaking this study, for those that are methodologically orientated, we conducted 10 senior officer interviews. I was also privileged to have access to 30 transcripts that the Army History Unit made available for this study. So the Army History Unit deployed historians to the field during the course of OBA and interviewed a wide range of ranks, compiled all the transcripts, and we were able to access those for this study. So coming now to these 3 traditional reserve compromises. The first is this: purpose. What is the raison d'être of the part-time force? Is it an expansion base for national mobilisation? Are we a home guard? Are we roundouts for full-time contingents operating offshore? Are we something else? Are we all of the above? It's fair to say that in the 2nd Division's history of 100 years or so, that our purpose has not been clearly stated. Ambivalent, ambiguous, various words you can think of to describe purpose. What is our contemporary purpose? This is really important because that influences the next crucial compromise, and that is training and resourcing. So what should the reserve be trained and resourced to do? Is it warfighting? Is it HADR? Is it both? And then finally, availability. To what extent is reservist availability limiting? Is there latent capacity there? And if so, how could we induce the reserve to serve more? You might even think about the purpose of the reserve as oscillating on a spectrum. At one extreme end, we've got warfighting. You might like to think about our Beersheba era in that category. And then at the other extreme end, you've got specialisation for HADR. And it's fair to say that over time, we've sort of oscillated like a pendulum across that spectrum. My question for you this afternoon is, where is the appropriate contemporary place along that spectrum for the reserve? So a quick snapshot or assessment. The reserve performed effectively over that campaign of domestic contingencies by doing 3 things. Firstly, by applying and adapting their existing warfighting and leadership training. This represents a strong case to sustain foundation warfighting with some minor adjustments. We'll come to those. The second thing the Reserve did is that they value added this civil military mindset and skill set, leveraging their natural advantages of geography, relationships, and on occasions niche expertise. The third thing that the Reserve did well is that we're well enabled by the full-time force. However, we were reliant on national cross-levelling of assets, and I'll come to that next. This constitutes a strong case to look at more distributed resourcing of reserve brigades in each jurisdiction. So here's probably the more extreme example of national asset cross-levelling that occurred during our time on OBA. So here's Omeo in southern Victoria, which was at the heart of the Victorian Fire Grounds. And we have, of course, here Townsville, home of the 3rd Combat Engineer Regiment. So, of course, 3CER deployed a squadron down to assist with OBA. This was a 3,000 kilometre road move. That squadron bought basic engineer plant and equipment, but it took 5 days, even once they were mobilised, for that road convoy to arrive and to get effect on the ground in Omeo. So this is an opportunity to look at improved distributed resourcing of reserve brigades in each jurisdiction to enable faster and possibly concurrent future domestic responses. Who doesn't like a slice of special rainbow birthday cake? The cake attribution is to my sister, so there's been no copyright breach here. But the concept we're trying to illustrate is that it's foundation warfighting and leadership training. That's the cake. The icing on the cake is the civil military mindset and skill set. And together, these are the skills to optimise domestic operational response. So you've seen here this image on the left, combat behaviours. So for domestic contingencies, you need this combo. Combat behaviours plus the civil military mindset and skill set. Currently, we would argue that this is more concentrated in the part-time component. That's just attributable to background. But the full-time component of our total force has been using this for decades. We know of it as train, advise, assist and nation partner capacity building operations. So the full-time force has done a lot of this as well. So the civil military mindset and skill set that emerged organically over this campaign of domestic contingencies represents for the ADF opportunities to embed this. So our ideas are revaluing the civil military skill sets of all members, building some business workforce intelligence of those civil military skill sets, task organising both in niches and in numbers for greater impact, scale and focus when we deploy during domestic operations, and regular exercises with our civilian response agency counterparts. So if we think about the ADF skill sets, it might be very tempting to say, why doesn't the part-time force focus on onshore HADR? Why doesn't the full-time force focus on expeditionary offshore warfighting skills? The problem is that the environment is not quite as simple as that. So our contention is that both the full-time and the part-time components of the ADF require both elements of these skill sets and a preparedness to apply either onshore or offshore. And a nice little quote there from one gentleman in the room. If you don't understand your own country, the multicultural, multiracial, geographically and ethically diverse country we live in, how are we going to win the peace overseas? So we have some opportunities. Minor adjustments to reserve training, to our task organisation and to our personnel processes. That will enable us to achieve greater impact, scale and focus through a more flexible force flow. Resourcing of reserve brigades to enhance distributed response capabilities within jurisdictions. This will give us faster responses with less concurrency risks across borders. Developing workforce intelligence on the civil military skill sets of all ADF members, because this will enable us to extract more capability value. Sustained and multi-level engagement with civilian response agencies in each jurisdiction. This will help us build interoperability. And finally, developing strategic partnerships with civilian employers of reservists so that we can increase reserve availability. So these were the recommendations that we tabled last November, and as you would be aware, some of them are already in the process of being implemented, so I'm really quite keen to hear your views, and we'll come to those. So just standing back from this slide, in terms of opportunities, as an ADF, we now know how to do domestic operations well. The question is that a good idea? Now, what do I mean by that? So if we come back to the purpose of the reserve, is it a force of choice or a force of convenience? So while the reserve is now a force of choice for some domestic contingencies, there are two associated risks that we need to bear in mind. Firstly, if we stereotype the reserve for that exclusive purpose, that may compromise ADF capability for higher spectrum military operations, including offshore, because that might also require a reserve response or contribution. The second risk is that appropriate investments in civil response capabilities and community resilience, those investments are needed so that we can avoid a potential default force of convenience, which would be a pitfall for domestic contingencies. It's also important to recognise the strategic opportunity costs to the wider economy of using reservists substantially more. So back in November of last year, this was Army's emerging C2 paradigm. We can see here the full-time component, the part-time component. We can see the force provider and the force employer. And most importantly, we can see the main effort and the supporting effort. So of course we have DJs, the Deployable Joint Task Force Headquarters, main effort, offshore contingencies, supporting effort, domestic contingencies. We now have, in the 2nd Division, the new JTF Headquarters, main effort, domestic contingencies, supporting effort, offshore contingencies. So what you can see here, ladies and gentlemen, is a lovely complementarity. Leading, supporting, leading, supporting. In short, a total force solution. It's not one or the other, it is in fact parts of both. And the closing slide, as we've been reflecting on this journey, whole bundle of compromises, some of them system imposed or system constrained, and with as is the case with all systems, as soon as you release one constraint, you go further down the road and you hit another constraint. So what we're seeing is the ripple effect of this recent campaign of domestic contingencies. So that you can think about as OBA. The first compromise we needed to overcome was our sense of purpose. Next one was resourcing and training. This one was availability. And as we zoom even further out, this is a big compromise. Forces for offshore commitments and how we balance that concurrency risk at a very high strategic level. And perhaps the largest compromise of all, Australia's population is obviously a finite human resource. We do have to bear in mind the whole of government and the economic consequences in terms of workforce within the broader economy of that finite resource. Ladies and gents, that's all from me, and I'm really keen to hear your views and your thoughts on the future and the purpose of the reserve.
Thank you, ma'am. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can see the number to call for questions up on your screen. And just while we're giving you some time to prepare for that, I'll just offer a few reflections and a question of my own. So you've gone through in your paper as well, and I thoroughly recommend you find it on the Cove. There's a link and objective to it, and do have a read. 3 compromises you've outlined there, and in your presentation today is the reasons why for the reserve forces for the 2nd Division more broadly. The availability is in the reservists available for what and how do we prepare for it, and then also what we're training for and how we're resourcing our people for that. The underlying assumption we made is that the high-end warfighting is the thing that prepares us to do all those other tasks that government requests us to do. And I guess my question I'm getting to is, with the broad employment we're being asked to, should we be focused specifically on high-end warfighting, or should the balance sit somewhere in the middle, or less attention paid to high-end warfighting and significantly more provided to HADR?
Wow, what a great question. And I'm interested in the audience's view on this question. Our findings is that absolutely do not detract from high-end warfighting. For that purpose, the Australian Army exists, and for that purpose we structure and we train. The issue is how much of our force can we raise to that high level? And if we think about the reserve, you can think of it as like a bell curve of people with a range of availabilities, of a range of longevity in terms of their service lifetime in uniform, and a range of motivation and other factors. Their time is discretionary. So really, if high-end warfighting is here, the question is, how much of the whole total workforce can we get to that high-end warfighting point? And what capability value can be offered sub that threshold? But undoubtedly, we are trying to get as many people as we can to that high threshold.
Thanks, ma'am.
Just my view. I'm interested in the audience's view.
And a follow-up question on that is, with the given model that we employ reservists on between 20 to 150 days per year, is that enough that we're actually delivering for our reserve capability to prepare for those tasks that we're asking? Is 20 days too little? Is 150 days too much?
Again, a great question. So, in last year's Defence Annual Report, so this is the annual report for 2020-21, which as we know was a busy year for the reserve all up, we had about 16,000 Army reservists that were paid at least one day. So if you think of the size of our reserve workforce, it's 1/3 the size of Army's total workforce. So Army's total workforce, about 30,000. Our reserve component, active reserve, another 16,000. So 1/3 of our force is reserve. In that financial year, the average reservist worked 50 days. And so I reflect, and that was a busy year for us. So I would reflect back. What do you think, folks? Is that enough? Is that a reasonable expectation for a part-time member who is also presumably working full-time and with other family commitments? So this question on availability, I think we need to cast back to our entire reserve workforce and ask the open question, how much availability can be offered? And if we offered reservists choice, how much extra would they choose?
Yeah, that ties nicely into one of the questions we received from the audience on the phone line. Have we actually overcommitted the reserve force over the last 2 to 3 years? And framing that question, you said in your presentation, it's about scale surge, not sustainment, not a sustained push. And also bear in mind that since 2019, the domestic security operations have been going on in terms of support to bushfire assist, followed by COVID assist, also aged care assist, and also COVID assist, and then other possible future contingency tasks that we might see in the near future. What do you think, ma'am?
We've got some cracking questions this arvo, folks. Gee whiz. All right, so on this one, I would say that OBA and OCA, their character was different, wasn't it? So OBA, bushfire assist, that was all about the surge. But OCA was a different challenge because it was about sustain. And when I said in the presentation earlier about the environment's not quite as simple as allowing an exclusively reserve response compared to an exclusively full-time response, the reason that model doesn't work is because our assumption that either a domestic contingency or an offshore contingency will be short and sharp, I don't think we can assume that anymore. It might be protracted, and if it is, as soon as one force element is called out or called for to respond to that, the other force elements need to be thinking about that as their warning order, because we're going to require a follow-on force. So in other words, we're not exactly in control of the duration of some of these tasks, which is why we need to think about rotation forces and why we need to think about a total force solution, whether it's onshore or offshore.
Thanks, ma'am. So another question we've got coming in, this one's from Colonel Ben Cottrell, Headquarters 2nd Division. How might we achieve greater adaptability in our workforce? And is this something we should focus on at the individual level, or should we be developing collective training plans to ensure we have that adaptability?
Oh, Ben, yeah, a really good question. Well, at the moment, under the Privacy Act, once we've enlisted a general reservist, so not an SSO but a GSO type reservist, after enlistment we're actually not technically allowed to ask or record formally a reservist's civilian job, qualifications, skills, networks. We don't actually do that systematically in terms of building a workforce database. So one of the options that our paper discusses and which we would like to explore is, can we do this more systematically? In other words, can we revalue the capability that we already have, not just in the reserve, so this is looking across the total force, but how about we have an inventory of skills, qualifications, experience and networks. And if we were able to assemble that, another organisation of our workforce size would regard that as huge corporate business intelligence that would drive value in their organisation. So given that the Australian Army is a people-focused organisation, this is something that we can look towards. So our ability to task organise for a niche depends on us knowing what types of skills our people have and who has got them. What I observed occurring during OBA is that the chain of command sometimes knew about the skills of our reservists and were able to deliberately configure things on the ground so that that person was able to be effective. But that's kind of a haphazard way of going about business, just kind of relying on knowing your soldiers. There's a smarter way of doing that, and it's called building that workforce intelligence. So I would be a big advocate of building such an intelligence.
I look forward to that intelligence database, ma'am. So another question from Major Erica Abend from 1446 Squadron in South Australia. We're seeing a decreasing availability of reservists due in part to fatigue, increasing pressures on them from their parent employers, family, etc., increasing transition out of full-time and part-time people for the same sorts of reason. So do you have any thoughts on how we can sustain the current tempo with an increasingly fatigued individual workforce?
That's another great question. Am I allowed to draw for this one?
Absolutely, ma'am. We'll work that out.
Thanks very much. So sometimes we have got a habit of assuming that we know what our workforce wants or needs. Some folks have spoken about the reserve specialising in HADR. Have those folks asked the reserve if that's what they signed up for and if they prefer a balance of warfighting skills? So when we think about some of the fatigue that's setting in, some of that could be attributed to where expectations upon enlistment haven't been matched by the reality, and you can have too much of a good thing. But the way I think about this, apologies, I'm not trying to be Clausewitzian with some sort of a wondrous trinity or anything, but anyway, that one's purpose. This one's training and resourcing. And this one's here is availability. And our question asker is spot on. There have been very substantial demands, not just, can I add, not just on the reserve workforce, but on the total workforce. So if we think about this as a trinity, so it's a triangle and it's got these vertices, and the problem is that they are all interdependent kind of trade-offs and compromises, aren't they? But in the middle of the triangle, we've got two things: recruitment and retention. And it's really important that we honour the expectations that we recruit and retain for, so that members don't join up thinking they're doing one thing, warfighting, and then find that they're spending a lot of time not doing that warfighting thing. And again, it starts with being smart around how we manage our workforce. How about we ask the workforce what its expectations are? So that would be my best response to that one. And apologies for my khaki-handed diagram there, but I hope we've got the picture.
It's outstanding diagram, ma'am. It does follow nicely into Captain Mason's question from 1st 19 Royal New South Wales Regiment. Is given the commitments to bushfire assist over the last years, as we've mentioned significantly throughout the presentation, the reserve force has been under relentless calls for support in a variety of different circumstances. And exactly as you've rightly pointed out here, is it's matching expectations with the reality, as in what someone was recruited to do and then what they end up spending the majority of their time doing. So do you have any additional thoughts on how we address that gap between expectations and reality, and if indeed that does exist, or we can do something better about how we communicate the expectations before people join up?
Really thoughtful question. So we did identify in our report an opportunity to develop a more strategic partnership with the employers of Australia. Because if you think about a typical reservist, not sure if there is such a thing, but if we just go with the typical reservist, they're balancing a bundle of things in the back end of their life. Primarily they're bundling whatever their full-time profession is. They are also bundling their family's expectations, and then they're also bundling the other either recreational or volunteer community-based activities that they're involved in, such as sport. So when you're balancing all of those and you're doing another thing, which is called your reserve service, where I'm going with this is that there's more than one stakeholder when you think about a reserve. It's their family, it's their employer, etc. So if the expectations of reservists have shifted, it's important that we take that whole community with us on that journey and explaining the case so that reservist families and, most importantly, the employers of the nation appreciate the expectations of reservists.
Brilliant. Thanks, ma'am. And following on from that, the engagement between reservists and their employers, and I don't know if you can answer this one, but a question is, what consideration, if any, has been given to contributions to the members' civilian employment superannuation schemes? And thanks to Major Rose from 2 Division for that question.
Major Rose, there's always a military historian in the ranks, yes. Well, for anyone who's familiar with the history of the Reserve, and I can recommend Colonel Dayton McCarthy's book, The Once and Future Army, which is our written history of the 2nd Division. But anyway, what Colonel McCarthy presents in that work is the history of the pay and conditions of the Reserve. One of the features of reserve service at the moment is the tax-free status. And when you look back at military history, that was awfully contentious to negotiate and get through. So we can't think about pay and conditions as just an isolated snippet. You've sort of got to look at the whole thing and review the whole offering there.
Thanks, Ben.
Yep.
It's another question from the RSM of 8 Brigade, Warrant Officer 1 Mick Lobb. So is scale of CIRCAT 3.5 without rapid contracting solutions in parallel not likely to meet requirement for the total force?
Yes, RSM cracker of a question. So speaking from our own experience during OBA, what we found is the call out as an instrument was fantastic at getting a surge of personnel. And then there was a bit of a bottleneck to get those people into the field, on the ground and on task. So in other words, a call out is about more than just the bodies. The bodies are of limited utility unless they've got all the bits that come with that. The vehicles, the plant, the chainsaws, etc. Now, if the reserve brigades aren't necessarily resourced with those other bits, they need some other means of being able to access it quickly. So I certainly don't discount RSM, say a contracted solution, such as a long-term contract with Kennard's Hire. But what we do know is the people, just pure boots on the ground, can only work up to a certain point, and then we need those and other enablers. So when we're going to surge, Army needs to think about not just surging the people, but surging all of the enablers around them.
All right, thanks very much, ma'am. It looks like that's all we've got time for today. So thank you very much for coming along and speaking to us. This has been an excellent and informative topic for 2nd Division professional military education. I really do appreciate it. On behalf of myself, the Commander, and the rest of 2nd Division, thank you for coming on down here. And ladies and gentlemen, if you could please show your appreciation. Thank you very much, ma'am. Great speech.